Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 9th of July. Today we're looking at the Pokrovsk Direction, and we'll then look at Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, and we're going to look at the bigger picture for a little bit and try to actually connect these three fronts together because they all do have a unified significance when you zoom out and look at the broader topographic and trench and unit composition dynamics. So we're going to do some of that today, but first I want to actually get into the concrete changes to the front line, which again are largely coming from Ukrainian sources at the moment. So for instance, we have this information coming out that the Russian forces have been able to advance 1.5 kilometers to the southwest from their previous positions that were located around Novopokrovsk. So they were able to advance through this open field region, basically bypassing the trench system, which is why I think that the Ukrainians by now don't have the ability to even resist over there. They've largely just retreated to the village itself. And so the Russian forces were able to neuter that Ukrainian stronghold and advance all the way to the outskirts, very close to these northern warehouses of the village. And you can see that the vector of advance that the Russians have embarked upon is on this northern flank directly overlooking the village itself. So you have this rather large hill over here where I'm marking with the red rectangle, and it just directly overlooks the valley on which Novomykhailiva Persha is located. And I've just been repeating this every single video by now, so you guys must know, but the region on which the village is located is essentially a small tributary or outlet for the Vovchansk River, and so that's just a part of why it is on lower elevation. And at the same time, we have the Russian forces continuing to strengthen their positions in this western mini salient as they try to get this solid control on the eastern bank of the river, and also are trying to get fire control and, of course, physical control over one of the last remaining crossings past the Vovchansk River going through Novomykhailiva Persha. So you have this one crossing over here, as we said before, and then one other one that goes further south from the village itself. And so that's why you have the second vector of advance for the Russians. They want to try to put pressure on Ukraine, either to actually physically cut them off or just to yield higher casualties for the Ukrainians while they send in reinforcements and then subsequently have to withdraw. Looking further north, you do have by now a pretty universal acknowledgement of the capture of Voskod and even of Avdiivka, although I'm not entirely sure about the final houses in Avdiivka in the western portions. There still may be clashes going on over there. But as time goes on, the Ukrainian grip over some of these local strongholds near Avdiivka is weakening, and there's a big question as to whether there even are large numbers of squads operating in these areas anymore, or whether they have been pushed back a couple of 100 meters westwards towards villages such as Vovche and Pokrovsk. And speaking of Pokrovsk, the Russian forces have been able to advance a couple 100 meters over here as well. We could actually measure it out to like 700 or 600 meters westwards along the railway vector. You can see how they advanced specifically along this paved road that is just right next to the windbreaks. So you have, if it's a vehicular advance, the MTLBs usually, but tanks, BMPs as well, advancing along this road. And then you have, accompanied by that, troops that are advancing along the windbreaks using the foliage for their own concealment. And that's how they gradually creep towards an area like Pokrovsk, which is now dangerously close to the front line. The Russian force is only about 850 meters away from it. And that's why you have now the Ukrainians trying to set up a sort of crest of defense here, utilizing the 47th Brigade and perhaps the 116th, although I've seen less from them, utilizing a active defense with Abrams and Bradleys being sent to the line of contact to engage with the advancing Russian forces in their armor. But by now it really has become really emblematic of this theater of the front that every single day there is a Russian advance along this rail line, and it is because of the momentum we talked about, because of how the embankment on which the rail line is located does dominate the surrounding villages, including the villages where the Ukrainians are now trying to regroup. And so yeah, that really does mean that such a small hamlet, which also doesn't have many fortifications east of it, you do have these sort of horizontal fortifications that weren't really meant for the type of advances that the Ukrainians are facing right now. And so they don't have much of a significance. And so that does really put a lot of danger into this part of the front line. But we're not going to look at it in isolation because you also had Russian advance in this region just east of Lozhuvatske. And so the Russian forces, they took advantage of their previous control of hills that are just between the rail line and Novomykhailiva. And from there, they just directly fired towards the Ukrainian defensive holdings in Lozhuvatske. I guess they would be manned by the 100th Mechanized Brigade and the 111th Territorial Defense Brigade. Those are the two units with an area of responsibility here generally. And Lozhuvatske, again, it's a relatively open area. You have some, I suppose, tree lines, but not really houses. And so any sort of force here that's become sort of exposed. Also, because it is located, again, on a tributary, it extends out of the Toretsk River, which I guess I'll mark it in red for you guys. Toretsk River sort of runs like this. And then it sort of pops out over here into the Lozhuvatske area. And that area is on rather low elevation compared to where the Russians were advancing from. And so they were able to comfortably advance westwards through this direction and reach the eastern outskirts, although now the village itself, or the hamlet, whatever remains of it, is currently in the gray zone. And so there are clashes going on over there. The reason why the Russians even want to advance here is, first of all, because they have an opportunity to, based on the elevation dynamics, which make it easier than advancing uphill, of course. Then Lozhuvatske actually acts as sort of way to unlock other parts of the front line. And so just looking southwards, getting control over this village would give the Russians this forward node to then advance southwards and sort of flank an area like Pokrovsk from the north as well, in addition to their current attacks that are going on directly in a horizontal manner along the rail line. And so it does open up another vector of attack from the north, and then more generally it could be used as a northern flank to attack Ukrainian holdings that are just east of the, or west of the Vovchansk River, I should say. And not just that, but it could also undermine various Ukrainian villages that are set up running along the Toretsk River. And the Toretsk River is a very important natural barrier because it does run through some of the Ukrainian strategic depth in this area, and then also does bisect through the highway, the Pokrovsk highway, which you see marked in yellow on the map over here. And so in that regard, the Ukrainians are using a lot of these frontline villages to organize troops and then send them to the line of contact and just stall any sort of Russian advances. And so the Russian forces, they of course would want to get control over those villages, but also they want to get control of the nearby hills overlooking them. That is even more important. And so the capture of Lozhuvatske also allows the Russian forces to continue pouncing on this sort of hinterlands in between Timofivka and Novoalexandrivka, located over here, so they could get control over those trenches and the hill over there to further overlook Ukrainian holdings that run along a more vertical sort of valley. And that vertical valley, I'll show you guys that in red over here. That vertical valley includes several villages that are protecting the eastern flank of the same highway that we talked about, including the very important ring road here, which is very important for maintaining control over the entirety of the flow of transport between the rear of Donetsk and Donbas in general, and then the frontline cities, and then actually reaching the actual ground combat. And so this ring road is very important, and the Russians, they do still have a rather long way to go when you're measuring it. It's not massive, but let's actually use the ruler here to see specifically. It's a distance of about 6 kilometers. So again, you're going to have forward Russian artillery from Charatina and from even westwards now on the high embankment, shelling towards that area, shelling any sort of transport that is moving through there, and then closer range mortars that are now being moved towards the Novoalexandrivka direction, also firing towards the Ukrainian holdings here. But actually physically cutting it off isn't just something that takes away from Ukraine's abilities to transport, but also then gives the Russians a new paved route, a rather large one, to then continue branching out and advancing in several directions, most importantly westwards towards the city of Pokrovsk itself, which is right now pretty far away when you think about it. And we're actually going to get into the ways in which the Ukrainians have been preparing essentially for engagements east of Pokrovsk. But just to finally zoom out and or zoom in right now and look at the final change to the front line, it's in regards to the area around Novoalexandrivka. The Russian forces were able to advance around 900 meters northwest towards the village of Vozdvizhenka. Rather small village, but it is important. Includes several strongholds on its perimeter. and it is the final village directly protecting the ring road, as we said. And that's a part of why the Russians are advancing through here, even though it's located on a valley. And so the Ukrainians do theoretically have the ability to overlook it from fields located here where I'm marking the X, and then also from this field that's further eastwards. And this is an area that the Russians, I think, are keenly looking at for reasons that I'll get to later. But in any case, you see the Russian forces still being able to generally advance along this paved road into Volodymyr, and that is something that is really threatening the Ukrainian really backbone in this area, I would say. And then last thing is this Russian advance that occurred through the open fields, about a 1 kilometer advance northwards. And this is what I meant when I said the Russians are also advancing directly northwards, because this region here with the open fields, which is in between Zelenopol and Kalinove, it's an area that right now the Ukrainians may have some positions in tree lines, but it's not an area with any sort of massive trenches. But the Russians, if they were able to get control over it, they would have this hill that overlooks to the east a lot of Ukrainian fortified structures around Kalinove, for instance, which is an area where a lot of Ukrainian forces have definitely regrouped since the falling of Ocheretina and Arhangelsk. And then it would also overlook that same valley line that I was talking about, protecting the road, the Pokrovsk road, and also protecting one of Ukraine's significant line of defenses here. And so let's look more generally at the defense lines the Ukrainians have set up and that they are continuing to build over the course of these past 7 months. Because really in the past 7 months, there has been a stark increase in the amount of works, the amount of fortifications that have been set up. And this comes after the decrease from 9 months ago in November from Zelensky to really ramp up building. And so we've seen that the most in this region because of the fall of Avdiivka in February. That kickstarted a lot of even faster building. But if we look at the sort of lines the Ukrainians themselves have set up, either in fortified areas or just using the basic geography and basically villages that were near the line of contact, we see the first line that was set up by the Ukrainians was generally running along the Durna River. And that line really did not stand the test of time because it was not fortified at all. It was haphazardly set up, and it was only maintained because of constant Ukrainian counterattacks that led to them shedding more blood than they really should have if they were just on a defensive footing. But it's something that was necessary in order to just maintain the current front line and not shift it further westwards. And during that time, they tried to just quickly construct and put together connecting various strongholds west of the Vovcha River that we now see set up, especially near the crossings of the river. And once the Durna River fell, the river valley fell to Russian control either in April or May. Pretty sure it was in April. Then you had these various fallback lines that the Ukrainians utilized. Again, not really fortified, not enough to really make them long-term plans, but just to try to buy time, as I said at the time as well. And that was throughout April and May, throughout these various tributaries that you see I'm marking in red right now. And you can't really consider those lines of defense. They were just sort of makeshift lines to prevent any sort of further undermining. And then you get to the next line of defense, one that has actually been prepared. And this is going to be a very important litmus test going forward, because here you had a Ukrainian line where they did have time on their side to a certain extent. They do have a pretty large concentration of forces, which has not changed significantly. It has changed really with the opening of the front line to the north around Kharkiv, for instance. That's an area where the avdiivka garrison did slightly get depleted, but for the most part, it does still maintain the core units that it had a month or two ago. And so in terms of manpower, there are a few mechanized brigades here that are spanning a front line that's, I guess, 20, 30 kilometers if we're going from north to south in this general area. But nonetheless, there are still key issues surrounding this line because the Vovcha River is not that wide. It can't be relied on as a body that just prevents physical crossings, especially in the areas that we talk about regularly where the Russians have the salient here, or Mezhove, Pokrovsk. And you already see how the Russians are not being kept at bay. They are continuing to advance along several vectors of attack, and nothing is really stopping that at the moment. The physical trenches, I guess you could say, they definitely would stop for a certain period of time frontal assaults, and if there were to be frontal assaults, then it would yield higher casualties for the Russians. But you do have to think about the Russians moving artillery closer to this part of the front line, stationing it on heights, and then being able to see all of the Ukrainian defensive works, and then also utilizing the Fab 3000s or Fab 1500s. I think we may see more 1500s here, just because you'd want to see successive strikes from Su-34s targeting a broader part of, I guess, a certain trench that's spread out across the field instead of a more concentrated strike. But any sort of bomb could be utilized. And so I do think we'll see more Russian air sorties here as we reach that point in the coming weeks. And then just zooming out for a second and seeing what's essentially the next parts of this line of defense going past the Vovcha River, which is marked here in red. It just continues going further north. You could see Novomykhailiva here. It goes further north along this particular valley that I'm marking in red. And it reaches all the way to the highway that we mentioned before, the highway from Maryinka over here, a suburb of Pokrovsk, going all the way north with these very dense trenches here. And you can see how dense they really are. And there's a good reason for that. It's because there isn't any sort of a large organized settlement for several kilometers in this X area here. And so there does need to be some sort of protection to ensure the Russians can't breeze through that area and then undermine the highway directly. And so that's why it's also important for the Ukrainians to maintain control over the current line of defense that is just a couple of kilometers, say 8 kilometers north of the front line, where I have marked these two lines, these two squiggly lines that I marked here that stretch from New York to the east to Kalinova to the west. That line is very important for the Ukrainians to maintain in order to still have that sort of depth in between the line of contact and between the part of the highway that's about 15 kilometers to the north. So keep that in mind. And these satellite images that you see on the map with the yellow lines indicating where you have dugouts, trenches, tank ditches, whatever it may be, they're not even complete, because since the publishing of these lines, since I added them as a file to my map, there have been additional constructions built by the Ukrainians, especially in this area between the highway that I'm marking in red and this sort of small line that you could see. It's not entirely complete on the mapping side, but you can see how it's running adjacent to this particular road over here, and it's just to the northeast of Pokrovsk. And so the area where I'm marking with an X, first of all, it's located on rather high elevation, depending on the points within those fields, but usually if you don't see a body of water and you don't see an organized settlement, then there are hills in this region. And so there is a lot of density that you don't actually see on the map that the Ukrainians have built over here, and it should really be marked in yellow. And that's a part of how the Ukrainians have been preparing for defending against the eastern flank of a Pokrovsk attack. So they're even trying to set up these lines of defenses, trying to do so with foresight in regions that are about 15, 16 kilometers east of the city. And then just on the outer ring of the city, you also see how there has been a lot of work both on the eastern side of the perimeter and the western side, and it's only about 5 kilometers away from the suburb of Maryinka. So just to conclude this part of the video, as I said, there's the Vovcha River line that we all know about marked in yellow that then extends northwards towards this highway region, trying to protect it. To zoom out one more time, you see how the highway itself connects from Pokrovsk over here all the way to Konstantinivka. And you can't see it written on the map, but eastwards you have Chasiv Yar here. And then to the southeast you have Toretsk. And so the Konstantinivka junction, which is so important and is also on a massive valley, it then branches out in 4 directions, including towards frontline cities like Toretsk, and then also going to the north to an area like Kramatorsk, and then further north to Slavyansk, which you can't even see from this point on the map. Zooming in once again, you also have Ukrainian construction going on a bit further west of the Vovcha River, centered around this rail line primarily, because this rail line does include a lot of major heights that are assisting the Ukrainians with trying to sort of compete with the Russians for parity elevation-wise. And so you have the Vovcha River line sort of extend outwards and then connect to the specific rail line over here. Then just sort of go north and run parallel to the rest of the Vovcha River line that we talked about previously, which runs like this. You could see it with the red line. and then the line west of it, which isn't fully seen over here on my mapping, or the mapping that I exported. And you could see how it just sort of runs over here through the highway again, through Maryinka, and it does add another layer of Ukrainian defenses. Once again, they are trying to protract the fighting in order to give them more time to finish up with these defenses. And then you already see how there are the outer limits of the city, which are being set up in this sort of circle shape to try to protect it from all directions. Now, moving on to the Toretsk part of the front line, we're going to begin with New York, where we received reports from Ukrainian sources that there were 8 fab bombs dropped today, and then on the Toretsk city itself, there were over 10 that were dropped, and so it's been a pretty eventful day for the Ukrainian defenders here. Not as much on the ground, more so in the air, and the implication is that the Russian forces are trying to destroy a lot of Ukrainian reinforcements that have been moved in a lot of larger structures within these cities in order to prepare for another round of attacks that will push directly through the suburbs and into certain urban areas. Because over the past few days, for instance, around New York, there has been some sort of stabilization in the sense that the Russian forces have not been able to penetrate directly to the heart of New York. Obviously, that could change depending on what happens in the coming days with the Russian activation, followed by the air support, of course. But we do know that the reason why the Russians were even able to achieve this breach and really achieve a lot of depth in their advance, it's something that's being claimed from the Russian side, actually, is that they were able to dig a tunnel under the New York area and bypass key Ukrainian strong points. Because you can see on the line of contact how there were these marked in yellow, very important Ukrainian trenches, a lot of them on vantage points, a lot of them using a lot of firepower, totally mined from all directions. And so the Russian side, they're claiming that they utilized this tunnel that was dug by the veterans PMC. Veterans PMC, again, made up of a lot of people that are from the DPR mainly, also some ex-Wagner mercenaries operating within the PMC. And so what's being claimed is that they were able to use shovels and were able to just create this man-made tunnel under the fortifications and then surprise the Ukrainians by making it out in the less dense area and the less well-defended parts of Horlivka. And because that area was not as set up and prepared for a defensive footing, because it was not directly on the front line, the Russians were able to solidify control here and force the Ukrainians out of their line of contact positions. And since then, they've been able to at least sort of solidify control over the salient that they already do have, which is dangerous because it is so close to an area like New York. It's only like 3 kilometers away, or I don't know why I said that. It's only about 1 kilometer away. And then it also does flank various salients where you do have Ukrainian frontline positions still being maintained to the east and also to the west. And so for now, we don't see any significant change here. But just going further north, we do know that the Ukrainians have committed another unit to defending against the Russian advances east of Toretsk, and that is the Safari Assault Regiment of the Lyut National Police Brigade. And this is also going to connect to the Chasiv Yar front, because the Lyut was previously stationed, at least partially, in the Chasiv Yar area, just south of Bakhkmut, around Klishivka specifically. And then when the Russians began attacking in Vovchansk, at the very least, I believe it's called the Tsunami Regiment of the brigade was actually moved to defend against the battles in Vovchansk. So that was their area of responsibility. And the only parts of the National Police Brigade that remained in the Klishivka region was Safari. And so now Safari has been moved elsewhere to defend against the Russian attacks around Pivnishnya specifically, due to, of course, the Russians being able to very quickly push through areas that should have been fortified and really should take longer because of their urban nature. And so now Lyut is engaging in the urban battles, something which they do have experience with, both in regions around Klishivka, for instance, where they did engage in a lot of house-to-house combats last year. And then not this regiment, but the other regiment is fighting right now in Vovchansk. And so they are really one of the main units at the forefront of the heaviest fighting right now, trying to fill in any gaps that they can. And you can see them actually filmed here in a video from July 6th, where the soldier himself defends in the suburb of Pivnishnya. And by now, also according to Ukrainian mapping, this is under Russian control, this area. But at least at the time, they were able to film a Russian soldier who was killed in the suburb region here. And so you do see how they were just very quickly thrown in and immediately got involved in the minutiae of the house-to-house fighting here, which is something that is definitely needed for the Ukrainians here, because they do need to try to bog down the Russians in order to get all of their logistics intact and also set up these makeshift defenses in time for any sort of future Russian activation here. And so, of course, for the Russian side, there are obvious objectives relating to capturing territory, capturing certain suburbs, certain heights, certain cities, as we said. But then there's also the other thinking of trying to divert Ukrainian sources, trying to divert them away from other parts of the front line to this area that was previously not thought about, in order to then stretch out the Ukrainians and then allow the Russians to just continue gradually advancing on other parts of the front line. This isn't a novel strategy. We saw it happen around Vovchansk. We see it whenever the Russians activate for a short period of time on any part of the front line, just to divert at least a battalion or several brigades into a certain region once they find a gaping hole in the Ukrainian line. Not necessarily because it's not fortified, but perhaps because there just aren't enough men fortifying the region. There is a difference there. And so Ukraine really had no choice but to send in reinforcements here. You could see it. They moved in. You could see marked here 1 brigade, 2 brigade, 3 brigades, a battalion, a regiment we saw, another brigade. So like 4 brigades that were fighting on the front line that had to be moved to here from other parts that are also relatively active. And they have to be moved from active parts of the front line because Ukraine doesn't have any other full brigades that are just sitting around in reserve doing nothing. And they have very little brigades, little ones that are fully committed to a part of the front line that isn't too significant. And if they are a part essentially of the front line that is seeing lesser combat, seeing smaller scale fighting, then that's also because they may be of a lower caliber than the ones that were actually moved to here. Because some of these units do already have a lot of experience engaging in some of the fiercest fighting. And so more broadly, just to connect Toretsk to the wider Donetsk axis or theater, you can see what's so important about it on this part of the front line is how the entire semicircle here essentially protrudes and acts as a massive buffer spanning 20, 30 kilometers from southeast to northwest to protect against the Russians reaching the highway over here that I'm marking in red, and from reaching an area like Konstantinivka, which is so important. Konstantinivka may be the most important city that I've mentioned out of all of these, because it does act as the junction between reaching an area in the west of Donetsk, like Pokrovsk, like Selidove, for instance, and then the east where you have the frontline fighting. And Toretsk does act as a buffer, and so do all of the trenches built around Toretsk, and so do all of the villages and lines of defense that you see in yellow that are built south over here, for instance, or over here, just to try to protect those flanks of Konstantinivka. And you could also see that really manifesting itself with the Russian attacks towards Chasiv Yar. What's the significance of Chasiv Yar on a broader picture? It would be the fact that Chasiv Yar really acts as the dominating height in the entire region. All of the city, mainly under Ukrainian control, but also some areas that Russia controls, are just on just massive heights, not just in Chasiv Yar, but also in some of the regions just south of it, in quarries and in open fields. And that entire region that is near the canal basically overlooks the line where you have Konstantinivka, its defenses, its valley that runs along the highway, for instance, and all of the villages that accompany that. And again, that highway, it then connects, you can't really see it on the map right now, but it connects to the northwest to areas like Druskivka and Kramatorsk. And so capturing Chasiv Yar on a broader level, it just gives you this massive height advantage to then overlook and fire, and then potentially in the future advance towards an area like Konstantinivka. And that's already looking into the big picture, but then you can see how there is a connection between the 3 Russian axes of advance. When you zoom in, it's hard to tell, but they are definitely all connected. And just to finally speak about Andriivka, which is a small hamlet south of Klishivka, this is an area where we do have a bit of a change, which I didn't mention before. And in this region, remember, the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, or Southern Brigade, I think, right now, it was partially moved to defend in Vovchansk. And so they do still have elements here, but it has degraded their forces. And also remember that the Russians they really forced Ukraine's hand into moving away the 28th Mechanized Brigade from this region. And so generally the Ukrainian composition here has been weakened due to those rotations. And you could see how that really has affected the front line, with now the Russian forces being able to advance from the fields, from the tree lines, from the windbreaks along the rail line. And you can see over here an advance at most of 1.15 kilometers westwards, reaching the hamlet of Avdiivka itself and actually reaching into the houses. And it's a video from July 8th of a Russian assault squad clearing out Ukrainian positions, including, I think it was one Ukrainian soldier who was captured hiding under one of their destroyed vehicles. So that's how they were just seeking refuge from the general volatile battlefield outside. And that also tells us how the Russian forces were able to reach this area. And the fact they were able to do that is because there just wasn't enough of man coverage to hold on to an area like this Avdiivka, which is just so exposed because it is an area where you could potentially move in soldiers, but it is really flattened by a lot of damage. And so you have to be careful and stay in basements. And then also it's just an area that's surrounded by open fields. Supplying that area is so difficult. So it is isolated. But we can see that the 93rd Brigade does still maintain some elements here, specifically the Signum drone group, because they showed their FPV hitting a Russian soldier in a dugout that was built in an area where we could see that the Russians advanced through. And so that just shows us that at least the FPV crews are still working here, spotting Russian soldiers and targeting them as they creep their way towards, like, Avdiivka, for instance. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.